Let's go ahead and begin, as we usually do, with the recitation of the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. That's on page 73 of the prayer book. We'll do this 3 times in English as usual. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's actually continue tonight to the middle of 76. When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who were wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, form supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust-free like you, the 3 worlds are not. Incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field, qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms, atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits, may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. So when Geshe-la returns for Wednesdays, I imagine he'll do that full prayer, so that's why I just added it tonight. And let's go forward to then either 97 or 98 for the short mandala offering, as usual. And then followed that with Refuge and Bodhicitta, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryata Yami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dagni kapsuchi daki chunyangi pesanamgi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsuchi daki chunyangi pesanamgi dola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin then. Give ourselves a chance to let go of some of the distraction in our minds, whatever preoccupations we might have, worries, what have you. By focusing on the breath for a few minutes, then after some silent meditation on the breath, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the chime, and again, just use whatever technique you prefer to work with the breath. And then again, I'll lead you in setting the best intention for being here. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. And to do this tonight, I'm just going to run through very briefly the points in the 7-point cause and effect method for developing bodhicitta, the foundation of equanimity. So first, visualize around you all sentient beings, friends, dear ones on either side in the space immediately behind you, enemies, difficult people in the space directly in front of you. And then surrounding these two beings that we have a more defined relationship with are the countless other beings who are strangers. And first, to set that foundation of equanimity, to think that these categories that we've placed these beings in, this is only temporary. This is very transitory from life to life, and even within a single life, beings change in terms of what category they are in. There's no real solid foundation for treating friends with attachment, having an aversion towards the difficult people and the enemies, having an indifference to strangers. All of these beings are equally worthy of all of our positive thoughts that we're going to generate. Moreover, every single one of them is the same in their fundamental desire to be happy, to not suffer. So first, briefly reflect on the fact that every one of these beings, because they've changed from role to role, every one of them has been in a very unique role. Every one of them has been your dear, kind mother. Has been someone that close to you. Even the most difficult person that you've met in this life has played that role. So now we're going to think of them in that role, recall their amazing kindness when they were your dear mother. Maybe your own mother of this lifetime can be a template for looking at that, but certainly we know this is a very powerful archetype in our culture. The mother who is there to protect us when we are at our most vulnerable, to make sure that we survive, to make sure that we are nurtured and cared for. Seeing that every being has played that role and has shown you incredible kindness, generate the wish to repay that kindness. And not just in temporal ways, because we have met with the Mahayana Dharma in this life. We have a way to repay this kindness that is so much greater than that. So already begin to steer your mind in the direction of the Mahayana motivation of bodhicitta. But in order to cultivate that, we need to generate even stronger emotion towards these beings. First, generating great love. Seeing all these kind mother sentient beings, wishing to repay their kindness, begin to generate that thought. How wonderful it would be if they had happiness and its causes. May they have these. And finally bring it to that level of great love by thinking, and I myself will place them in happiness and its causes. Without any exceptions, every single sentient being. And since they are also suffering, generate the compassion that embraces all these beings with the thought, first, how wonderful it would be if all these beings were free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. Everything we've been studying in this class, all the delusions, all the afflictions, especially the root of ignorance. May they be free from these. I myself will cause them to be free from suffering and all of its causes, and really take that personal responsibility. And then this gets funneled into that exceptional resolve, that idea that we will absolutely do this, even if it is by myself alone, even if I have to do countless eons of work to lead every single being to enlightenment. I am dedicated to doing that. But how will I do that most effectively? This is how we arrive at bodhicitta, because that is the answer. By becoming a Buddha ourselves, we will then be fully empowered to lead all sentient beings through our perfect wisdom, compassion, power, be able to lead every one of them to complete enlightenment. And this is our motivation for engaging in these teachings tonight. Just feel your heart filled with that strong aspiration, encompassing all the beings you visualized around you, knowing that what we're doing here tonight will benefit each and every one of them besides ourselves. A little extra chime there from the chocolate bowl. Okay, so in the text, we are nearing the conclusion of this text. In the last class, we did a little diversion into looking at the causes of the afflictions based on what we saw on page 90. There was this wonderful paragraph from Gompawa, who said, in order to abandon the afflictions, you must know the drawbacks, the defining characteristics, and the antidotes of the afflictions, which we are going to discuss later tonight, as well as the causes for their production. So again, there's this wonderful teaching that comes from Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi, the Bodhisattva levels, that Lama Tsongkhapa has in his Lamrim Chenmo. And I've been sharing quotes from that, as well as Geshe Sopa's commentary on that called Steps on the Path to Enlightenment, as well as Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa's book Wisdom Energy, where there's a chapter dedicated to the 6 causes of the afflictions. So let's go ahead and do a little slideshow thing here to get us back into this. And let me do a share with the folks at home. Okay, I think they should be seeing that now. We have 6 causes, as I mentioned, and the first 3 we went through last time. I'm going to just do a very brief review of those, because they are the 3 that are most important, in my estimation. I think even Geshe Sopa, in that one quote that I'm going to reshare tonight, talked about the importance of these 3, the role that they play. Because I think we have to say that in every case when we have a delusion arising, all 3 are there. First, we have a basis or karmic imprint. This is kind of the main cause for an affliction or a delusion, is the seed that we planted through having had that delusion before. So we all have the seeds of ignorance and jealousy and greed and anger and all the afflictions. You know, everything we looked at, all the secondary afflictions, root afflictions, all of those, we have the seeds of in our minds, meaning that the potential is there for them to manifest given the right conditions. Without getting rid of those, we're never going to be completely free of the potential for the delusions to arise. We can suppress them a lot so they don't become manifest, and we can do a lot of work to diminish the power in our minds, but until we uproot them completely, this will always be there as kind of a fundamental cause for the delusions to arise. The second one is the object, which is something that triggers that delusion, and we have different objects that can trigger different delusions. I mean, look at the sense objects in particular are a good part of this, but we can also have mental objects that will trigger things for us, recalling something, a memory, and so on. But nonetheless, it's often through the senses that we receive some sort of stimulus that causes the process to begin in relation to that. So something that is, again, we know from the text when we studied the omnipresent mental factors, that you have that factor of contact, which is already determining at that level when we have contact, the mind coming together with an object, what it's going to be perceived at. We have perceived as, in terms of whether it is going to be something pleasant, something unpleasant, or something neutral. Then we have the feeling that is induced on the basis of that contact. Again, and that feeling is going to be one of these 3, pleasant, painful, or neutral. And again, we have varying degrees, everything from just mildly unpleasant all the way to, can't stand it and, horrific pain kind of thing. And the same for pleasure. We have everything from mildly pleasurable to great ecstatic bliss, all those kinds of things that can arise in the mind. We generally will have a delusional response to those things. With regard to neutrality, we tend to just kind of zone out and reinforce our ignorance. But in terms of attachment, we have all of those, pleasant objects, we have all those that are in the vein of attachment. We normally exaggerate the qualities of that and so on. This is getting into the third one here. But the object is playing a role in that. It's inducing a pleasant feeling through our contact with it that then starts the process. Because we have the seed for attachment to arise, then generally we are feeding that attachment through our thinking, our mistaken ideas, and so on. Same for the unpleasant. When we have the unpleasant experience because we've had contact with an unpleasant object, something that is unpleasant for us, again, it's not unpleasant by its own side, because something that we find unpleasant, somebody else might actually enjoy. So that process that begins with the contact with an object that is unpleasant for us, that induces that feeling of unpleasantness, pain, causes a whole process, which once more we're going to talk about in number 3 there, for us to exaggerate the unpleasant qualities, to then have an aversion towards that object, to have anger, push it away, whatever the case might be. So the first 2 are definitely playing a role. The potential is there for that to arise. The object comes into our sphere of experience. And then it is the third one that really propels it right in the direction of the delusion. Our inappropriate thinking, our inappropriate attention. And so then another 3 that we're going to look at tonight are those. So let me just review what was in Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo, because it's very brief. He said, basis, the first one, refers to the latent proclivity for affliction. That we have those potentials out there. Second, object refers to the appearance of objects conducive to the arising of an affliction. So once more, they are specific to specific afflictions, but nonetheless, this is a necessary component. Some object has to appear. As I said, if it isn't an external object through the senses, it could be something that we are recalling. So say all of a sudden something triggers a recollection of what somebody said to you yesterday that was really unkind, that you're still angry about. The words aren't being heard at that time, but you have a recollection of those words through the mental image of those words that is implanted in your mental consciousness. You can then bring them back to mind and run them through your mind and recreate the delusion all over again. Attention, the third one, refers to incorrect attention that projects pleasantness onto what has an unpleasant character. So this is in terms of this first noble truth, that we have many things that are by their nature unsatisfactory, but we nonetheless put a lot of pleasantness on it. But even just pleasantness being put on something that doesn't really have pleasantness from its own side. This is obviously part of the delusion that's going on here. That's the deeper level of ignorance. Conceives an impermanent thing to be permanent and the like. This is, again, in a more classical way, in my estimation, because you can have a lot of other patterns that are part of this inappropriate attention. As I said, it's a lot of superimposition, exaggeration. We make, for example, if we come into contact with a person who we find to be disagreeable, unpleasant, we paint them entirely disagreeable. We can't see at that time any positive qualities about them. And so at that time, we have used our incorrect attention to create a fictitious object. So the object itself is the person and what they're saying and doing, but we create it into something much more than that. So as Geshe Sopa says in his text, and I shared this towards the end of the last class 2 weeks ago, from Steps on the Path, it says, in general, we say that an affliction arises when A, this is the first factor, it has not been eliminated from the root. So you still have that potential, those seeds, that basis there. B, the object is nearby, either, again, mentally or physically. And C, you perceive that object erroneously. If you're seeing it truthfully, if you were seeing it through the lens of emptiness, at the deepest level of, lacking any error, then you wouldn't be reacting to it, because you would know that there's nothing from the side of the object, that it's solely coming from the side of your mind in terms of your imputations on that. So this is, again, when we have all 3 of those going on, this means that, to begin with, the affliction is abiding in your continuum as a subtle propensity. Then an object acting as a suitable condition comes into proximity. And finally, although that object is impure and has a nature of causing suffering, you view it as pure and a cause of pleasure. Again, this is getting at some of these 4 mistaken conceptions that are behind a lot of our problems, that we see that which is suffering as being pleasant. We see that which is impermanent as being permanent. We see that which is impure as being pure. And we see that which is selfless as having a self. That's the deeper error. That wasn't even mentioned in these writings, but obviously I think in Lama Yeshe, in Wisdom Energy, he talked about that. That's obviously the deepest error that we're making. That is part of our inappropriate attention or mistaken attention around objects. So any questions up to this point on these 3? Hopefully you've had some chance to pay attention to your own minds and how these are obviously playing a role. In the Monday class, we've been working mostly with anger and kind of the antidotes that we can introduce, that change the third factor, essentially. You know, we can have the seed for anger in our minds, we can have the object of anger arising in our experience, but we have to stop the way that we're thinking about it, because our thinking about it is what's inducing us to have angry thoughts. So let's go on to the remaining three, which are only there, in my estimation, on occasion. I mean, but some of them obviously are more frequent than others, particularly this one, habituation. Habituation refers to the process of becoming accustomed to past afflictions. Obviously, we have some afflictions that we are much more habituated towards. And each of us know our own minds and know what are our particular ones that tend to manifest. You know, when we have people who say, you know, that they are very angry people, what they mean is they're habituated to the mind of anger. You know, they have, through the force of their own buying into the thought process of anger, probably quite unconsciously. It's not like they sit there and making decision, oh, I'd like to continue developing this mind of anger. They are just simply not having the tools, not having the ability to do anything about it, so they strengthen the habit of anger. So they're not really angry people. They are people who have developed the habit of anger, who have that angry kind of mind stream much more frequently because of that. So habituation does play a role sometimes, but then there are those of us who, I'm not myself, I'm not saying, but there are some among us who might find that they only get angry occasionally, right? So anger isn't maybe habituated. It's not something that's a real habit for them. There's only certain things that trigger them. There was one person at the master's program, Nohoko Watanabe. She was from Japan, who was studying in the master's program, and everyone thought she was the most patient person in the world, because I don't think any of us ever saw her angry. She was just very sweet and always just very easygoing. And so, you know, she's not habituated to anger, so she doesn't have this factor. But no doubt there will be something that some point in her life would trigger it, because if she's like all of us, if she isn't a, you know, Buddha or something, or somebody who's gotten rid of their afflictions, well, then she has the seed for that. She just has done a lot to diminish the potential for that to arise. So let's look more at habituation. There's not a lot on this in these slides, but a little bit. From Wisdom Energy, Lama Yeshe says, the fourth factor increasing the strength of the delusions is habit. It can work this way. At one time, you had a certain experience with an object. When you meet a similar object, you reenact the experience, and each time you repeat the action, the strength of that memory increases, becoming more powerful and distorted in your imagination. You know, so this is how we build habits. I sometimes talk about them as like grooves in our minds. You know, like it starts off as just a little bit and then becomes deeper and deeper grooved, where you fall into it quite easily. You know, just like if you had, I don't know, you know, I don't need to explain it probably, but so continues, he says, habit builds up certain associations so strongly that whenever a similar situation arises, your mind automatically runs toward delusion. Some people become so obsessed in this way with a deluding object that they cannot forget it. Why does this happen? Because the experience has been repeated over and over and over again, making the imprint of it thicker and thicker. The mind dwells in the recollection of this experience, adding to the delusion. So this is sometimes too what happens, right? You know, when maybe we have somebody who's in our life on a regular basis who's triggering a particular type of delusion, then because of the prominence of that and our thinking about it constantly, and even when they're not present, we're entertaining those thoughts of anger or whatever the case might be, then we add to the delusion by virtue of our repetition of those same thought patterns. From Steps on the Path, Geshe Sopa calls this becoming accustomed. He says this means that by repeating certain behaviors over a long time without applying an antidote, he mentions this, which is kind of interesting. You know, this is part of it, is that why we're learning all of this is because if we can introduce an antidote, then we weaken the strength of that habit, right? We can keep ourselves from going to the place of full-fledged anger, can catch it when it's just a minor annoyance or just a feeling of unhappiness, then we'll have a much better kind of foothold on all of this. But he says here, you become habituated to those actions and they become your natural, ordinary, and daily way of life. So once again, I'm sure we've all known people in our lives who we've thought to be just kind of pretty angry people, and they've just developed that habit of anger in their minds. And that is something that I think is important for ourselves, as well as when we look at other people, is to not see them in terms of those, using those adjectives, that they're angry people. They are people who become accustomed to anger, who have habituated themselves to anger, because people and their delusions are two different things. You know? Yes, we as people want to take charge of our delusions in our minds, but nonetheless, most people don't even have that ability. So it's good to have that kind of separation. The mind and its delusions are one thing, the person is another. The person is fundamentally pure and can, work with that uh, idea that they can remove all of that. That is not who they are inherently. They aren't inherently angry people. Were you going to say something, Bob? I'm sorry. No, okay, I thought I saw a hand. All right, that's the fourth one. Any comments or questions on that? Anything from folks at home? Let's continue, because again, these last ones again, these two are more kind of external factors, the fifth and the sixth, whereas kind of the first four, well, the second, certainly the object is an external factor, but then, it's our relationship to that object. Here, it's how we are influenced by things outside of ourselves that we may or may not have a whole lot of control over. The fifth one in the great treatise, this was translated as social context, refers to the influence of bad friends and foolish people. So we have these kind of mistaken friends or influences from outside of ourselves. This is why often when we're beginning our Dharma path, they say it's really quite important that we make sure that we are very discerning in who we spend time with, because we're trying to move our minds in a very different direction from where they've been habitually. And so if we continue to be around people who are misleading for us, we're going to keep going down the same pathway, not create that new pathway. So we are influenced by the people that we hang around with, that we have some association with. In Wisdom Energy, Lama Yeshe talks about this, saying that the fifth factor mentioned by Lama Tsongkhapa is influences from the outside. Negative, misleading friends who give you diluted information are included here. These are the people you know who make you confused. Therefore, whom you have for friends is very important. So again, I think this is something that, I'm not saying that at the beginning of the path is the only time we pay attention to this. Obviously, throughout our path, we want to make sure that we're not under the influence of people. But once we develop a stronger mind, then we shouldn't have problems being in the company of people like this, and perhaps even using it as part of our path to strengthen our resolve to remain in a mind of Dharma in the midst of people who are trying to take us elsewhere. And I often compare this process to what happens in when people finally go into recovery after dealing with alcohol abuse or substance abuse of some sort. When you first go into recovery, you are so susceptible to the influence of those things that you are trying to avoid, that hanging around the people that you used to hang around with who were using or drinking or whatever, it's not a good idea, right? Because they're still engaged in that behavior. So again, we know that that wouldn't be wise advice to give to somebody who's trying to break free of that habit, that addiction. So it's the same here. We're dealing with an addiction to the delusions, to our own way of, our old way of thinking, that we want to move in a different direction. So why would we continue to be hanging around with all the time people who further the delusions, who cause us to want to go out and party and do whatever, all the things that may not be so useful. So the final little bit from the third source that I'm using, Geshe Sopa's commentary on Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, calls this social distraction, refers to those worldly activities that bring you under the influence of unwholesome acquaintances. When you spend your time with people whose minds are completely distracted by drinking, playing games, and wasting time, this naturally contributes to the development of afflictions such as attachment, hatred, jealousy, pride, and so forth. This kind of social distraction can be very powerful. So again, it doesn't mean that we shut our hearts to these people, and sometimes we have to be around these people because they're our family or they're people that we interact with on a regular basis, that we have a commitment to doing that. So once more, it doesn't mean that you say, well, I'm sorry, get out of my life, I don't like you anymore, or anything like that. It's that you try to find a way to maybe decrease the time that you are around folks like that if you can. If you can't, possibly sever that time with them. But then also, once more, as I said, to recognize that the goal isn't to completely isolate ourselves from anybody who's misleading, because most of the world isn't practicing a Buddhist path, right? So we're going to be around a lot of people who may further our delusions. So here, the idea is that if we generate some strength of mind, we can actually be amongst those folks and not be under their control or under their influence. So Again, there's some pretty strong statements out there. I think I've shared this one before that came from a text that Lama Zopa shared that was from, I don't know if we pronounce Acho or Achos, A-C-H-O-S is how it's spelled, Rinpoche, but there's no S's at the end of Tibetan words usually, so I don't. So anyway, there's this, in this text, he says that you should discard misleading friends the same way that you discard essentially used toilet paper. And so he uses the idea of a used rock, which I guess they used the rock to wipe their bottoms and then threw it back in the stream, I guess, or something. But I don't know what they did with it after that, but they discarded it, obviously. It's like, I'm not going to walk around with this rock after I've used it to wipe my bum, you know. So that's a pretty strong statement, you know, to kind of say that you're going to treat misleading friends like you would use toilet paper or something. But the intention is just to recognize that most of us, at least again, initially in our path, don't have that strong determination and will to go in a different direction. So we can very easily fall back into patterns. So again, for personal reflection, if you look at this and you go, well, God, I got a lot of these people in my life, what should I do? Well, you know, I think it's a personal exploration. It's not to say that, again, every one of us has to sever ties with every one of these people. We have to look at, once more, one of the things that obviously can happen over time is we might become a more positive influence on them. But nonetheless, you know, they do say that initially it takes, and there's even one of these Kadampa sayings, like I can't remember the exact one, something about a really good person in the midst of bad people will go wrong, whereas a really bad person in the midst of good people, I don't know, anyway, the idea is that it's very hard, I think, for most of us when we don't have strength of mind and will to be among people who encourage this type of behavior and the delusion. So just see that this might be a factor for you. It may not be. You may look at your own mind and your own practice and say, well, no, I don't really have, you know, that problem with, you know, people in my life being an influence on me in a negative way. And that's great. If you don't, you know, that's wonderful. Rejoice. Any comments on this one? Let me take it off the share for a little bit in case there is a bit more talking on this one. Anyone? Everyone is super clear on this one. Yes, Aspen.
Can you do a quick summary of what you just said?
Yes. So we're looking at one of the factors that causes our minds to be more deluded and afflicted, and one of them is misleading friends. Oh. Have you heard of those?
Oh, you have no idea.
Had a rough 48 hours.
Okay. So yeah, we can see that, you know, at certain times in our life in particular, people can take us down the wrong path. You know, people can really, I mean, and we're going to get into the last one is where we look at the bigger influences that we have, which can come from more formal education that we have, but can also come from just the media and influences in our world at large. But we see how much we are in a society that embraces particular ways of thinking, that thinks that those are really healthy ways of talking about justice, talking about what is fair, talking about all these things that are going on in our world, and making statements that are pretty outrageous. You know, so if we have friends that we hang out with who have some pretty strong views in that way, who think that, you know, people who molest children need to be, you know, executed, and I mean these kinds of like thoughts that can be pretty strong, and they're always trying to push those ideas on us, always trying to get us to agree with them and what have you. Sometimes it can be really hard, you know, to maintain one's own integrity in the midst of people who are misleading you. And again, I'm talking there more a bit about views rather than looking at behaviors. But I think if this is true, we are influenced in a lot of ways. This one, I think, does tend to be more around the people in our lives who cause us to move in behaviors that are contrary to the Dharma, whereas the next one is more about those things that are influences that cause our views to be contrary to the Dharma, and consequently our delusions to arise. No other? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I actually am reading a lot of the Buddha Sutras. I mean, the Buddha himself emphasizes many of the sutras. I mean, this is a big point that we often talk about the importance of having good friends and how badly bad friends could negatively influence you.
Good.
I mean, it's not just a philosophical point.
Right. Good. Yeah, Bob was just recounting his, been spending a lot of time looking at the sutras, and in a lot of the sutras, the Buddha is emphasizing this idea of paying attention to having good, close friends and what have you. I mean, that's part of why we have, we call this a sangha. Sangha is loosely used there because it's not really technically what we mean by sangha. Sangha is used in quite a number of ways in Buddhism. At the deepest level, it means the sangha jewel, which are those beings who've had direct realization of emptiness. Then we use sangha often to refer to the ordained sangha. But when we talk about it as a community, we mean those people who are like-minded, who support us. I'm not saying that in these walls we're completely delusion-free. I think that would be that would be a mistaken idea. But we are all on the same path of trying to counteract the delusion, right? So we're hopefully doing the work to be able to relate to each other and support each other in our spiritual path. So I think that that's an important component of it, and why the Buddha himself even developed the ordained sangha at the time of monks and then nuns later, to recognize that there was a need for people to be supported with good companionship with people who were practicing the same tradition. So, okay. Any other comments? Let's go back then to the slides. I will share with the folks at home again. So the sixth one, again, there's different names for this in the different translations in the text. From Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, it says explanation refers to listening to wrong teachings. So this is how it's usually introduced in the text. It's kind of like the idea that you got some sort of teachings in some sort of formal way, from people around you that influence you to think in a particular way. So for some of us, in that vein, it might be other spiritual traditions or ways we've had of looking at things, that were okay.
Yeah.
Are you okay? Break my heart. Oh, good. We'll send you lots of loving kindness. So for some of us, that might mean that when we studied other spiritual traditions, or when we, had other things that influenced us from kind of philosophical viewpoints or whatever, that is part of it. But, sometimes they even call this following wrong tenets, which means, that kind of we've gotten introduced to ways of thinking philosophically about life and about the world that are incorrect. But obviously it's much bigger than that, particularly in our modern age where we have so many more influences that are bombarding us day in and day out. I saw somebody posted something on Facebook today that says we have too much information and not enough wisdom. It's like really true. You get a lot of information, but how much of it is wisdom? How much of it is really cultivating that type of mentality? So this sixth factor, Lama Yeshe says here, called following false teachings, differs from the previous one, the fifth factor, which concerns choosing those who are bad influences for company. The fifth factor relates in general to your lifestyle, your surroundings. Whereas this sixth factor, however, means believing that someone is a special teacher, therefore listening to and following all the wrong conceptions he or she teaches. So that's, again, how it's quite traditionally set out. The same is true, though, he says, of all types of information. So much comes in, but generally there is no integration and no differentiation between what is useful and what is harmful. People just bring it in and just think, oh, my friend said that on Facebook, there must be some wisdom there. I'll just follow that. Well, no, you have to use your own discernment. It is kind of interesting when you go through Facebook and look at kind of different things that different people post. In fact, yesterday I saw something that somebody posted who's a friend of my sister's, and I really took a lot of issue with what she was posting, but I didn't know quite what to do with it. But it's just like, we do have to have some discernment in terms of what we are allowing in, and sometimes we don't even have much control over that. But then if it comes in, what we do with it, a lot of it, we can discard that like used toilet paper too, and just say, thank you very much. It's not a view that I'm going to subscribe to. But there's a lot of information out there, right? Lama Yeshe says, this is, and keep in mind, this is 40 years ago probably that Lama Yeshe was teaching this. In fact, nearly every aspect of Western culture, books, magazines, movies, television, and the like, is totally dedicated to producing more and more desire and superstition. I don't know if I should share this or not. I don't really watch that many films, but I usually try to watch the films that get nominated for awards, figuring, well, that's kind of the cream of the crop, I'll just watch those. And so one night we brought home 3 billboards outside of Ebbing.
Oh God.
That was devastating.
I mean, it was just really a horrific movie. I couldn't believe, and people, I can't. I'm glad I didn't have the theater experience of like being there when everybody's like cheering on this woman doing all these horrific things. I mean, I'm not saying that she wasn't right in wanting the police to investigate her daughter's disappearance or whatever, but it was like the way she went about it was just like really horrible. I mean, of such a vengeful mind. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anybody else got that when they watched that film. To me, it just wasn't a very good film from that perspective. It was teaching kind of a way of looking at uh, revenge that was really not good. I mean, revenge itself is not a good concept. You know, I don't know. Couldn't really see. People, yeah. When you watch things through the lens of the Dharma and kind of see the karma involved and the karma they're creating in the midst of all of it, it becomes more of a nightmare than it does like any kind of entertainment, anyway. But so this is true. I mean, movies, television, everywhere we look, there's kind of like there's another sort of subtext to a lot of what we're getting, which is embedded in our culture. And our culture has a lot of ways of looking at things that are not really healthy. I mean, that's why we have war and we have, injustice, and we have a lot of things in the world is because people are not being kind of treated to more wholesome and healthy ways of looking at life. So I think this is, again, what part of the Dharma is, to help unlock some of that, to help us not be be under the influence of this factor in our lives. So then Lama Yeshe concludes, he says, in short, misconceptions and misinformation cause more delusion if the mind lacks discriminating wisdom knowledge. So whatever information there is that makes you become more confused should be avoided as much as possible, unless you have the wisdom to discern through it, to be able to look at that film or that book or that person who's posting on Facebook and what they're saying, and be able to discern what is good or bad about that. And again, good or bad, I'm not making it into a dualistic kind of thing. It's what supports the movement towards liberation and enlightenment, towards being, free of the delusions, versus what exacerbates the delusions. So this is really a pretty big factor. Again, I don't think it plays a role sometimes, in the moment, but it's kind of a backdrop to why we think the way that we do. I mean, look at what's happening around road rage. I mean, so many incidents of this, right? Where people feel that when they believe that they are right, that they have every right then to do whatever it is to prove the other person wrong, to even shoot at their car, it gets to be pretty crazy, like the justifications that are being set out there. Now, obviously not everybody's buying into that, and society at large doesn't want to become like this, wild, wild west, everybody out on the road with guns shooting at everybody else. Let's hope it never comes to that. But nonetheless, this is why this behavior happens, I think, is because people are taught to defend themselves in the face of this. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to go too far in my little soapbox or anything. But I think a lot of people are even, and I don't think it's just boys now, young boys, I think young women as well, are also taught to defend themselves from a very early age. That if somebody's saying something bad to you, you stand up and fight them back or something, which isn't really the best solution to things, right? We have to find more creative solutions to ironing out differences among people. And this is where, a lot of habits and patterns come from in the world. So let's go on to what Geshe Sopa says, and then we'll open it up. There's just one slide for this. He says, the sixth factor causing afflictions to arise is explanation. This refers to listening to various kinds of wrong or harmful teachings, or reading books that lead your mind in the wrong direction. Anything that's kind of an external influence. It isn't those immediate people in your life that you're hanging out with, but those things that can seep into your mentality through this constant barrage of stuff that we have. So these are the six then that we just went through. Again, the first three being there absolutely with every time we have a delusion arise. The other three playing a role, and this is why I changed the order, as I mentioned previously. If you go to Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, they aren't in this order. But I put them in this order because I think these last three are important to talk about, because they can play a role, but they are not all necessarily there. So, all right. Any comments or questions on any of this?
What a very timely, appropriate teaching you were giving.
Oh, Aspen. Did you want to share anything more? I don't want to put you on the spot if you feel compelled to.
It's just like weird that you're talking about this, and it's exactly everything I should have been doing is like however long.
Oh, bless you. Well, you know it now. So, but
At the end of 18.
yeah, and exactly. I mean, much younger than I was exposed to these teachings. So, I think this is great. We all have time, so, and it's not to expect that once we get a teaching like this that then we're going to be practicing perfectly. That's the reality. Is we still will make mistakes. We still won't have the best judgment all the time. We might not have all the perfect discrimination, but we just do what we can to keep moving in that direction. And that's what's important. That's where progress comes from. So good. Thumbs up.
Yes, that's why. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go back to our text then and just read a little bit more of what was on page 90. We're in this summary. And again, I'm not going to read the rest of Gompawa's paragraph that I started just before we went into these final slides, because I read that last time. Let's go to that paragraph that starts as just as it has been said above, as soon as an affliction arises in your continuum, having forcefully recognized it, thinking, this is it has arisen, you must examine which causes and conditions produced it, and what the object of observation from which it arose is, and then, regarding it as a fault, hold it as an enemy and immediately overcome it with the antidote. I mean, sometimes people will find that even just having the awareness of the process is enough to diffuse it. And it depends upon the strength of the delusion or your own familiarity with things. But sometimes when we are hyper aware, that of what's going on, that's enough to go, oh, here's that object again. I have the habit of getting angry when I meet that object. I need to stop thinking about it in the way that I've been thinking about, so that I create a more healthy pattern, so that I don't have a mind of anger. And then if you do need to deal with that situation, you're coming from a different place. You're coming from a place of understanding and wisdom and compassion, rather than coming from a place of delusion and craziness and anger. So the whole point here is, again, that if you have the awareness of what's going on, you're going to be able to potentially diffuse it in that, or introduce an antidotal way of thinking that will cause it not to go in the same direction. So I want to talk a little bit about antidotes. There is this little quote. Let's go through that quote. The spiritual guide Puchongma says, even when I am quashed by the afflictions, quashed by the afflictions, from beneath I grit my teeth. It's an interesting saying. I'm not sure. I've never gotten commentary on that one. Gritting our teeth is not like the perfect antidote, because in my mind, it just kind of means that we're going to, but it means that we're going to have to keep working forward. We're going to have to do something, not just grit our teeth. We're going to have to really put some effort into it. When we have delusions in our mind, this is a wonderful way to frame it. I haven't been doing this as much with the Monday class, but anger is a great friend in terms of what it can teach us about how to work with our own minds. We've been trying to learn that through, the other way of acknowledging that as we generate more and more patience, we become more and more content inside. But anger actually can teach us a lot about things. It's like a mirror that is going, oh, this is what's going on in your mind right now. What do you do in the midst of that? So I think this is the important thing, is understand whenever a delusion's arising, whatever it might be, if we are vigilant, paying attention, it's a perfect opportunity to increase our understanding of our own minds, to increase our understanding of the practice of the Dharma, until we are able to keep them from arising at all and eventually annihilate them completely, which is where we're going to go in terms of the text, is to talk about the temporal kind of antidotes versus the more ultimate antidotes. Let's go to the slides, where I prepared a few slides that I think might be useful for how we talk about this. This is by no means meant to be kind of definitive, just my own kind of way of presenting this. This isn't like coming from a Lamrim teaching. Part of it is. It's not that it's completely, something of my own creation. But there are probably infinite ways to counteract the delusions when it comes down to it, because every one of us has unique minds, and I'm sure we can come up with our own way of working with them. But nonetheless, an application of opposing wholesome patterns or antidotes to the delusions can be done in at least 3 ways. And so I often talk about the first line of defense, which we have talked about when we went through the object, the second of the 6 causes, right? Which is avoidance. So sometimes we can use that as a defense. And sometimes that's the best place to start, because if we don't have the strength of mind, particularly to keep ourselves from getting angry or upset, or to keep ourselves from going out of control with desire or whatever the case might be, or being jealous, then maybe it is best to remove ourselves from that situation. So I'm going to talk about different ways of doing this avoidance, or being able to be more aware of what's going on in the mind is even a bit of a form of avoidance. The second line of defense is reframing through temporal antidotes. Temporal antidotes, of course, here, the more that one that's usually called a temporal antidote is the one that is most opposing to that state of mind. But nonetheless, there are a number of different thought processes that we can introduce, and I'll go through those too. And again, there are many of those for the variety of delusions, but these are kind of a little bit more specific for that particular delusion. That's why they're called more temporal antidotes. And they work in the time of that delusion arising, but they're not going to work in the time of a different delusion arising. So what I use to counteract attachment isn't going to be the same as what I use to counteract hatred, because it's a different mindset. Now, again, there are a few things that could be used from one delusion to the next, and we'll go through those. But when we talk about what's really meant by the specific temporal antidotes, those are quite unique to that individual delusion. The third line of defense is undermining them through the ultimate antidote. Ultimate antidote, anyone? What's the ultimate antidote? Wisdom, realizing emptiness, you know. So this is, of course, further down the road, and yet we can undermine the afflictions greatly if we have great familiarity with the wisdom, realizing emptiness, because at that moment, if we are able to think of the lack of an inherently existent I that we feel is the target of all of this stuff that the object is doing, we're able to think of the object being empty of inherent existence. We are able to think of the whole, everything involved, what are called the three spheres, all being empty of inherent existence. That can be very powerful. But if we don't have much strength of knowledge or wisdom of emptiness, then it probably won't be quite as effective. So let's look at the first one, what I call avoidance. The first one is to physically remove oneself from the object, you know, to say, thank you very much, but I can't be in the presence of this object right now. You know, so again, if we have patterns that are really kind of pervasive, like I mean, people who do a lot of online shopping or something, I don't know if anybody in the room does that, but like if you're always going online and always like checking out this store, and then a little ad pops up and you go and you click on that and you're off in another store and you're looking at all the merchandise they have there, and you're just generating more and more desire in your mind. Well, then maybe you need to go offline, shut off the computer, turn off your Wi-Fi signal, whatever you need to do to give yourself the space so that that delusion isn't arising, right? Because the object isn't there that's going to move you in that direction of enhancing your attachment. It's the same with anger. Now, again, sometimes we might be confronted with situations that we can't physically avoid. This is part of life too, right? That there are situations where we can't remove ourselves physically from the trigger or the object, but we can mentally distance oneself through observation of the process and not reacting, you know, kind of being like a log. Rachel, as part of the Monday class, she taught the one session for me, and she talked about in anger in particular, how you need to have an awareness of what's going on in that first bit of time when we're getting angry. It's actually called the 6-second rule, right? Where there's a chemical response and everything, the lizard brain is pulling into, you know, high gear. We have this thing that happens quite automatically within our bodies as human beings when we are triggered by something that is you know, distressing for us, that is unpleasant for us. So to be having a kind of that awareness of what's going on and to be kind of attentive to that, and then to mentally be sort of like a log, to not be so quick to react. Remember, most of us, when we were quite young, our parents said, you know, before you say anything, if somebody upsets you, count to 10. You know, well, 10 is 4 seconds beyond the 6-second rule if you count really slow. If you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. If you really give yourself that time, you know, this is like a mental distancing. It's like, I'm not going to go to the place of that immediate reaction. I'm going to actually be still, be not involved, be not engaged. So these are, again, just some suggestions along this vein, but I think mental and physical avoidance is oftentimes that first line of defense. Not that mental distancing is that easy to do. I think that it can be actually really difficult to do. You know, if you have somebody right in your face, like say you just did something that they really took offense to and they're just yelling at you right in your face, I mean, it's really hard to like kind of keep your composure and be in a space of stillness in the midst of all of that adrenaline and everything going on in the body. But, you know, this was Master Shantideva's advice in the 5th chapter of Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, to be like a log. You know, the big thing was to not physically or verbally react. I mean, if we can keep the delusion at a minimum, maybe it's still like racing around and we're getting kind of angry, but we're at least not opening our mouths and saying something stupid or getting our fist and getting ready to punch the other person or something. So this is the first line of defense in my estimation. The second line of defense, as I said, is reframing through what we're calling here temporal antidotes, which once more, there are more specific antidotes. That's the third bullet point here on this chart. The other two I threw on here as kind of like, from my observation, I think that they can be, they're more like a universal antidote. They're still very kind of in the moment though. They're not something that is going to get you to a removal of the delusion eventually. They can play a role in that. The first one is to recall impermanence. And impermanence here can be mostly thought about in terms of the fact that situations are always changing. And so if we're looking at it from the point of view of attachment, for example, well, let's say we talk about those objects that we are attached to, whether it be a person that we find attractive or whether it be something delicious, delightful that we want to possess, some object of the senses or what have you. We recognize that those are fleeting and temporary experiences, right? They don't last over time. So our attachment is lessened by virtue of the fact that we are looking at the object with a little bit clearer vision right here, right? We're seeing it for what it is, that it is only a temporary, transitory experience, that it's not something that is greater than that. So we're not going to have the tendency to exaggerate some sort of lasting, permanent quality on it. So the impermanence helps there. But even in terms of like angry situations, I mentioned this in the Monday class recently, you know, that this too shall pass, right? Anything that's brought you anger in this life has eventually receded to at least some form of a memory. Whether you still bring it up and still keep inducing thoughts of anger about it, it's no longer in your life directly. That person or that situation is past. So that's one way of thinking about impermanence, is just acknowledging that we're dealing with transitory situations in any of these situations where the delusions are arising in reference to an object. The object itself changes, the situation changes, you know, nothing sort of stays the same in the midst of all of that. So sometimes we react definitely from a place of thinking that it's stuck right there, it's going to continue to be there. And of course, for the mind of attachment, we want it to continue to be there, right? We want to have that everlasting pleasure that we are getting from it. And for the mind of anger or aversion, we can't stand that it's in our sphere of experience, but it feels like it's going to be there forever. In the moment, we can't understand that kind of transitory nature of it, that this person in our face isn't going to, eventually they're going to get tired of being in our face and go be in somebody else's face, I imagine. So this first one is, again, just, it's an antidote, but it involves a reframing. It involves some actual thought processes. Whereas the first line of defense is more about shutting down the thought or moving away from it so that we aren't going down that pathway of thought. This is where we have to change our thoughts. As I said, reframe. The second one is the disadvantages of these negative states of mind. This is brought up in almost all of them. Think about the disadvantages of anger. Think about the disadvantages of pride. Think about the disadvantages of jealousy. Think about the disadvantages of these. Sometimes that also can help us to see that it's not such a good idea to follow those states of mind. Be very powerful, particularly around attachment, you know, because attachment seems like it's got nothing but advantages to it, because it's getting us objects of pleasure, holding on to objects of pleasure, not wanting to be parted from objects of pleasure. So in the case of attachment, we really need to see that it's not our best friend at all. It's actually creating unhealthy patterns that keep us bound up in samsara, that keep us with this unquenchable thirst, continually going after, you know, this object and that object. So I put those two separately because even though they might be mentioned sometimes in regard to temporal antidotes for one or the other or what have you, I think it's true for all of the delusions. We can apply this idea. Like even if you look at jealousy, for example, if I was jealous of what somebody else possessed, the things that they had, say their youth and their beauty or whatever. Well, that too is transitory, right? That's impermanent. That situation changes. I was young at one point, no longer am. They are young now, and they're not going to be. I mean, all these things that we might be jealous of, they're part of the process of just the eternal change. At some point, whatever we're jealous of with regard to that person, they're going to be parted from those. So again, it's just a way of reframing it so that we don't have those states of mind arising. And certainly jealousy has disadvantages. It doesn't allow us to rejoice in the good fortune of that person, which is a much more positive state of mind, right? To actually think, oh, the reason why they have such good looks, or why they have a beautiful car, or why they have all these things in their lives is because they've created the karma for that through positive action. So I can rejoice at that level. And then I take a different, orientation on the situation. Finally, the third one is applying specific antidotes that counter that unique or particular affliction. So this is where we get into the ones that are usually what we call the temporal antidotes. So let's talk about those, because we did this already when we went through them, but I just want to refresh people's memory. What would we say is the most specific antidote, temporal antidote to attachment? What is attachment doing? It is honing in on the pleasant characteristics of an object and exaggerating them. So, yeah, Stephen.
I guess one powerful antidote is to look at the negative characteristics of that object and use it
Good.
as a counterbalance or a counter.
Good. So Stephen's saying, yeah, that the temporal antidote is then to focus on the negative or the unattractive aspects of that as a counterforce to what we are focusing in on and only seeing at that time. That'll be a much more balanced viewpoint, right? I mean, we're not talking about going to the level of oh, I hate this person now because I was attached to them and I thought they were the greatest thing in the world, and now I think they're just horrible, awful. I don't even want to be around them. I mean, that's not what we're talking about here. We're just trying to get a more balanced viewpoint of that person, because the mind of attachment elevates them to being something much greater than what they currently are. And of course, frequently they can't hold onto that view because we've created it, and they're just who they are, and they end up being a disappointment to us because they're not in line with our exaggerated view of who they are. So if we have a more realistic viewpoint of it, if we are able to bring things down to a more accurate perception, then this will counteract our attachment. Now, again, why these are called specific or unique temporal antidotes is because you wouldn't use that same antidote with anger, right? Because what is anger doing? Anger is looking at the unattractive aspects of that being or person or object or whatever, and focusing on that and seeing them as even greater than what they are and wanting to push them out of our sphere of experience. So why would you focus on the unattractive aspects of the object when you're already there? You're already, that's what you're singing. The whole thing is, that's your tune, is that's the most awful thing in the world. You don't want anything to do with it. There you have to generate. And of course, when it's with people, they say that the antidote is love, compassion. We see that person who is being cruel, who is doing things that are harming us, that they're under the control of their delusions, and therefore are nothing but an object of love and compassion. Because if they were genuinely happy, if they were free from suffering, they wouldn't be doing these things. So that would be a much more healthy mind to have towards those who harm us. And of course, in general, though, with the mind of anger, we say that the antidote is patience. But again, as we've been seeing in the Monday class, we have to have techniques to generate patience. Patience doesn't always come that easily. Patience is essentially a mind that is undisturbed in the face of harm, in the face of, people doing things to us, in the face of even the difficulties, the troubles that we have in applying these teachings. But nonetheless, we do often need accompanying thoughts to help us to practice patience. As I pointed out in that class, we were all told to be patient at times when we were quite young, right? Just be patient, just sit and be patient. And you're like, well, but how? how am I supposed to be patient when all I can do is think about, all these things that I'm excited about, or that, whatever. So again, I think we need more techniques to kind of help us to be patient. But there are myriad techniques in Buddhism around being patient. We've been exploring some of them in the Monday class, but know that in most Lam Rem texts, they go into a lot of the thinking around how to cultivate a mind of patience. certainly Venerable Tipton Children's book that I've been referring to in that Monday class, Working with Anger, is really useful to get a handle on how to be more patient in the midst of a mind of anger arising. So again, these specific antidotes, like the specific antidote to pride, anyone recall, like when you're feeling very prideful, what you are to think about? Because you could think about impermanence, that all your knowledge and possessions and everything are fleeting. You could think about how it doesn't give you the opportunity to learn when you were in a very prideful state. But what is the more specific one? Yeah, Stephen.
One of the things you could think about all of the vast topics of, for example, the Abhidharma, is that
Yeah, the Abhidharma. Yeah. Yeah, so Stephen is saying that often the more textbook temporal antidote is to think about all the stuff that you don't know, all the knowledge that you don't possess, or look at texts like the Abhidharma Kosha, any of these Abhidharma texts that are the foundation for what we've been studying here. And you just immediately kind of recognize how limited your own knowledge is. Or even just to think that, if we're looking particularly at our knowledge, well, if we're that great in what we know, well, are we enlightened yet? Are we there yet? If we're not there yet, well, then we still have some work to do. And of course, even in regard to possessions, all of these possessions, things that we might be really prideful of, or our appearance, or whatever the case might be, people put a lot of pride into a lot of different things. Some of these other antidotes might be more effective to think about impermanence and what have you. But also to think, while we've created the causes for this lifetime, there's no guarantee that we're always going to have these qualities. Might go back to think about, well, are you creating the causes for these? If you're just being prideful, then you probably aren't. So I think that, again, we can find that this process of working with each delusion and kind of saying, well, what could I do to change my thinking right now that would weaken that delusion? And especially those things that are directly opposed to it. So jealousy, the opposing mind, is to rejoice, as I said, to really be happy that other people have the things that they have in their lives. We talk about miserliness. That was one of our secondary afflictions, right? Miserliness. Anybody, how would you frame a specific antidote to that?
Generosity.
Pardon?
Generosity.
Yeah, the mind of giving.
Giving.
And how would you support developing the mind of giving? Just like when we talk about patience being the antidote to anger, how do you support?
Gifts.
So you might need to think about the benefits of giving, the fact that, everything that you are being miserly of came about through the force of your past giving. If you have some conviction in karma, then that's the absolute truth, right? You might think, well, no, I got all this money because I inherited it. My parents gave it to me, It's like, well, but you still created the karma to have that inheritance. That inheritance is only there because you created the karma for it. And how did you do it? Through giving. So if you want to continue to have things in your life and not be, without resources in this life or, future lives, well, then you have to create the causes for that. So I think absolutely the mind of giving is the more direct antidote to the mind of miserliness, but sometimes we need more thought processes because perhaps that miserly mind is more our pattern than the giving mind, Any other comments on that one, or should we do any more? I don't know if we need to do any more. So investigate these to some degree. Go back and look through, the root delusions, root afflictions, the secondary afflictions, and see if you can see ways of using these ideas of these temporal antidotes to dismantle. Because once more, the idea behind this in Buddhism is we're never talking about suppressing, our delusions or something, especially anger. We're never talking about kind of like stuffing our anger down. It's like, rather than the mindset that creates anger, we're going to have a mindset that creates something else. And again, when it's working with other people, when we have hatred or anger towards other people, then it's the mind of loving kindness, the mind of compassion, the mind that sees them in a very different way. That's why I've mentioned this before, but at the end of the Light of the Path retreat sessions in North Carolina, the last one that was in 2017, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it was after the election, at the end of each teaching, he would say, and as part of his dedication, the dedication is very long. When you've ever been at Rinpoche's dedications, you know that they go on for a while. And he said, and may bodhicitta develop in the heart of all Americans, especially Donald Trump. The only reason why he can say things like that is because he doesn't have any delusion towards Donald Trump at all. I mean, he actually is seeing him very clearly as a being who is an object of love and compassion, and how he wants him to generate that mind in his heart, because he knows that this will be the solution to all of his problems, but also the problems of the world. I mean, to some degree, not that he's going to solve all the problems of the world just by virtue of that, but he'll certainly be a much more contributing factor to that side of it than what has happened so far. Nonetheless, we don't always know who people are or what's going on with them. Is something, yeah, that I think we need to be also aware of. But yeah, Amy,
Would you speak to
let me turn off the
how
slides
to
for a moment.
handle if you have both attachment and anger toward the same person at the same time?
Attachment and anger towards the same person at the same time. Well, I would say that you can't have them both in the exact same moment of time, but nonetheless, you can be going back and forth between those two, because they have a very different kind of mode of apprehension. When one's looking at somebody with anger, one is seeing the unpleasant characteristics and so on. When one is looking at somebody with attachment, one is seeing the pleasant characteristics. But you can vacillate between those, absolutely. And oftentimes we get quite angry at people when they have been an object of attachment for us, and we have a greater expectation then, and we have it more on the line with them too, frankly. Because what the mind of attachment, when we're dealing with people, we get attached to that person because it's coming from an I-centeredness. It's me wanting what I want from that person. And as long as they keep giving me that, then I keep being attached to them and to some degree satisfying them. But once they back out of that contract, once they say, I'm not going to give you what you need anymore, I'm doing something opposed to that, well, then that's when our anger arises even greater, because we had an expectation due to our attachment and closeness and proximity to that person to think that they were going to continue to give us what we need. So I would say that the two often come hand in hand. In most of our personal relationships, we have some level of floating back and forth between those two. Again, a healthy relationship would be where both parties are recognizing a concern for the other that is not about receiving what I want, that is disinvested and de-invested from that I and the cravings and needs of that I. And we'd have really healthy relationships then, because everybody would be other focused, in intimate relationships as well as in the world at large. It wouldn't be about what I need from this. It would be about what you need. And then if I'm doing that with Stephen as a friend and saying, what does Stephen need, and trying to take care of Stephen's need, and Stephen is doing that to me as a friend and saying, what do you need? Well, then our needs are both getting met, right? But it's not about Stephen wanting me to meet his needs and me wanting Stephen to meet my needs. It's rather the focus is on other.
So what would the answer be then? If somebody's going very quick task switching back and forth.
Well, I think you have to recognize what's the antidote in the case of this flipping back and forth between those two. I mean, it would probably depend upon so many other factors. I would say if you have more harm coming about through the force of the anger, then that would be the one I would work on mostly, is to diminish the anger, because that's probably where it is said to be a much more harmful affliction. But we do have to see that the reason why the anger is there is because of the attachment. It's the way Venerable Rabina often presents it. She said that, I think it was Lati Rinpoche who kind of worded it that way. I think it was. I don't remember which teacher she said, but she said that anger is what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So if the strong attachment is there, then the anger is inevitable, because we aren't going to get what we want sometimes from that person. So we might be able to diffuse some of the anger, but if we haven't dealt with the attachment, it's going to be very hard. So I don't know if there's one antidote that kind of gets at both, unless we go to the ultimate antidote. Tonglen. Yeah, Tonglen is essentially love and compassion. That's kind of an antidote to, and it's also combating our self-centeredness. Maybe Tonglen is a good antidote for both. So that would be effective. Yeah, Bill.
It's interesting and amusing to me, because I'm going to tie it back to something you started with.
Uh-huh.
Well, when you were talking about that movie, right? So
Mm-hmm.
being a person of the theater and film,
Uh-huh.
I struggle with that a lot, because I think of a lot of what we when you start to look at things in this way, a lot of what we put out there in terms of not just entertainment, but even what we would call the good stuff, the thoughtful stuff,
Sure.
can be so disturbing. It really can. I often struggle with, why am I doing this? Because I'm not sure
Right.
I want to be putting that out there. But at the same time, it's funny that, it's not funny. It's so appropriate to be hearing things discussed in this way, because what you're using, the way you're describing this stuff right now is almost the exact terminology we use when we're talking about acting technique.
Wow.
Or dissecting a scene from a directorial point of view.
Right.
It all comes down to relationships. And the first question a director asks an actor, what does your character want from that character? What do you want? And what are the obstacles? What's in your way? Why aren't you getting what you want?
Right.
And they talk about changing tactics to get what you want. And it's called an objective. What do you want from that person? And it's ultimately when we,
Right.
People from the actor's point of view, people have been studying this for a while now, a couple hundred years, and it all comes. That's basically what normal human relationships come down to is what do you want from the other
That's
person?
interesting. Yeah.
And we talk about emotion as being a result of that. So bad acting is I'm angry. Good acting is okay. I'm angry, but why?
Right.
Because I want this from you, but I'm not getting it. So therefore, I'm behaving in this way. And that's the kind of thing that, as coming from that world, like being ashamed sometimes of the stuff we put out.
Right.
Coming from that world, when you start to look at it that way, it actually gives me a little bit of heart, because if we're doing anything, if we're succeeding at all, it's maybe sometimes helping other people, the audience, understand.
Okay.
Because we often call it the observation of human behavior, how
Right.
we start to dissect why we behave the way we do.
So
And this would all be very helpful for
Sure.
actors to learn too.
So Bill was just sharing from his experience in theater and acting and directing, how there is that idea of what's your objective in playing out a really good emotional scene is what do you need from the other person, and trying to answer that question so that you're very clear about what's in the way of getting that, all the various things that play out. But also the comments that you made in talking about that essentially there's there is a lot out there that is just examining it from the point of our deluded human behavior and putting that out there that other people watch and find somewhat entertaining, but nonetheless, is not necessarily perhaps the best thing for people. But also, recognizing that this is what we're dealing with. It's theater and movies and all of that are really just like a mirror of our own world, sometimes taken to higher degrees of things. But no, I appreciated what you shared, and how even actors might benefit from learning some of what we're talking about here, because it really shows, kind of what's going on in the mind. I think Buddhist psychology is pretty spot on. I'm not saying Western psychology isn't. That's not my point. I think that actually cognitive behavioral therapy is probably pretty close to a lot of what Buddhism teaches, which is essentially having an awareness of one's own mind, what's happening, and doing things to change one's thinking in the midst of that, so that one's behavior then changes. But nonetheless, there's a lot of wisdom in the Buddha's teachings that I think we could use and one day hopefully see manifested in a lot of different ways. I think there is some good stuff out there too. I do agree that there are some movies and some things I've seen that were really quite inspiring to see people tackling delusion rather than being kind of succumbing to it. But were you going to share something, Espen?
Oh, I was just gonna add on to what you said, because we put on a production this time last year. It was about the Sandy Hook school shooting. And
Oh, wow.
Everyone was like devastated after it for like weeks. We were all like emotionally dead afterwards.
Wow.
And I think I asked myself the question, like, did this help people or did this make it worse? Or did this
Right.
make us feel, do we feel better about this because we put this on? Or do we feel worse because we put this on?
Right.
I mean, we got so into the play that the last night of the show, we only did 4 nights of the show, all the actors were back behind the audience crying and hugging each other.
Wow. Yeah, it was kind of a catharsis.
It was insane. I mean, we got so into the characters and, the objective and everything.
Right.
You get told, what's your objective? What are you trying to do here? And it was to get that message up. I don't know if it actually did me good.
Yeah. hard to say, because a lot of people, I'm sure, came to see it, and each took away something different. So again, for those online, Aspen was just sharing her experience as being part of the theater group at Santa Fe High and doing a play about Sandy Hook shootings, and wondering, is it a good thing or not to have that as sort of the topic for people to come and engage in. But I think, again, that when we certainly deal with things in our society that need to be brought to the forefront and kept at the forefront so that there's some attention to these issues, that awareness alone may be good enough, regardless of what other things might have played a part in that. But
Well,
Rachel.
also your minds were changed by the feeling.
Yeah.
So that has its own ripple effect.
Yeah. So Rich was saying, and that their minds were changed by doing it, and what you shared at the end about, after the last show, just really breaking down and hugging each other, crying at the end of what's, I'm sure, a very emotional experience to go through that. So somebody asked me when I did the Copan course back in 2015, there was a woman there who's an Indian actor, really amazing. She's won like all these awards. But anyway, she asked if being an actor and being a Buddhist are kind of contrary. It's like, can you do what? And I go like, Richard Gere. I mean, hello, Richard Gere. I don't think so. I mean, I think that actually you might get really good at being able to observe your own mind. But yeah. But I think that, I guess when it comes down to, and I think part of their question was, when you are in a role where you are playing a person with anger in their minds, are you generating the negativity of having anger in your mind by acting out anger in a fictitious way? And I guess it really depends on that actor, but I would say that probably you could be really skillful in being able to do that without having the anger really being there. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I guess I was just speculating, theorizing. I'm not sure that I really know the answer to that. My acting is limited to one little play I took part in when I was in high school or grade school. So I don't feel like I've got the knowledge as a working actor to be able to address that. But I think that actually you could probably become very skillful in knowing your own mind by virtue of having to play so many different roles and looking at being able to change to be, it might lead to some identity crisis, like who am I really? Maybe that's a good thing too. You might start questioning, who is that I that's underneath all of these different roles. But especially these people who do the method acting where you're like, Daniel Day-Lewis is like that, right? Where he's like in character all throughout the entire production filming, prior to even, right, to getting the character. So like you go down, Daniel Day-Lewis's family goes down to breakfast and they're having breakfast with Abe Lincoln one day, and then they're having breakfast. Must be pretty strange. But that type of acting I think you would get really quite familiar with your mind. I don't think you would lose the sense of your mind is taking on these things in a kind of false way. But I guess without some other context, you still wouldn't necessarily do deeper work. Anyway, we're getting into speculation territory here, but thanks for bringing that up. I think it is a really good.
That actually is a reference. Aspen, maybe you know the Dustin Hoffman Laurence Olivier story. Yeah, we can tell you later.
It's okay.
There's a direct
Okay.
reference.
Okay. All right. We'll look forward to that at some point. So we're already to 8:18. Hard to believe. Let's go ahead and wrap up for tonight. And then when we return next week for the final week on this text, as well as my last Wednesday here before I start traveling again, we'll finish the text. I only have a little bit more to go through on antidotes. And then there's a few pages left, but really there's not a lot of content in these last few pages. It's just reiterating a lot of the same ideas that we've been looking at. So we'll do that when we return, finishing off the text. Let's go to page 235 and do the dedication prayers as we usually do, the first two, holding those very strong thoughts that everything that we've done tonight is to create the causes for all sentient beings to become enlightened through our own enlightenment, and recalling bodhicitta, how amazingly powerful this mind is and how important it is that we and others develop it very deeply in our own hearts. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Page 244. And making strong prayers for the health of His Holiness, who a week ago we were doing puja for him. And those of you who haven't heard, he's seems to be fully recovered almost. It was quite amazing. There was another report on the internet today that he's doing very, very well. So we can continue to make prayers for his good health and long life, as well as Rinpoche's, as well as all the teachers that we and others have in their lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, dedicate for those beings that you're holding in your heart right now. And we have members of our own community who have passed away recently or are dealing with difficulties, problems. We can think about them, but also anyone else who's have obstacles to their well-being, who are ill, who are dying, or who have died recently. Sending this positive energy out to those beings so it can become the cause to relieve all their suffering immediately. And then also to bring them all the perfect conditions so that they can find true peace and happiness immediately. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much.